So in that case, how do we change our view on risk, our approach to risk?
Well, there's a short-term question and there's a long-term question. So short-term, we who have grown up in an environment that has misinformed us about risk need to become curious about how it really works, how things at a scale that doesn't match our daily lives really unfold so that we can get smart about it. In the longer term, we need to take seriously the process by which culture and other forms of learning cause minds to form. In essence, if you think about the way we educate children, we're completely backwards about it, and we don't even think about how odd it is to take children and put them in a room and try to get them all to face forward and then scratch things out on a chalkboard, or if we're modern, project them on the wall. When really, learning should be exhilarating, and it should involve puzzles that properly show the mind what it can't access directly. In other words, there are certainly games we could invent that would alert children to what a black swan event was, right? How unexpected things can come out of nowhere and upend your expectations built on the average situation. So really, we should be, at this moment, thinking, what is the ideal package of games and puzzles and exercises that would keep children focused on things that would cause their minds at the point they reached adulthood to have all of those things on board, so that when they faced questions like the ones we've faced, those questions would be much more intuitive to them than they are to us.
So is that another case of us just relinquishing our responsibility in the present and just hoping that the future will solve it?
Nope, we've got to do both. We have to get through the bottleneck, which means that we, who went to school that wasn't all that useful, have to figure out how to keep things going for the next 100 years, as we are figuring out how to improve the educational system so that it makes wiser humans to solve the next set of problems.
I mean, is it useful to flip the question in some sort of way and just assume that humanity doesn't have a future, and then use that as the narrative that forces people into action?
Yeah, this is a tough one, because in every room, at least every one I've seen so far, there's a dichotomy between people who are motivated by hope and people who are motivated by fear. And neither of these things is wrong, right? You can have a rational conversation in either one of those paradigms. What you can't do is have those conversations together, because if you want to talk about how serious things are, you start robbing people of hope and they become frustrated. And if you want to appeal to those who need the hope, then you leave those who are motivated by fear with the sense that you're not being realistic. So anyway, I don't know how we divide those two conversations or train ourselves to be able to tolerate the sort of breadth. But it would be great if we could get past that, because I have the sense that this might be one of the things that makes the problem very difficult to solve, is the sort of dual irreconcilable obligations that come along with the conversation.
So on that note, who here is motivated by hope about the future? All right. And then who is fearful?
Interesting that hope outnumbers fear in this room.
Especially in this audience.
Yeah.
Have you been to virtual futures before? The other way round. So in that case, if we're stuck between these two potential ways to generate narratives, you've said that the one way, or the one evolutionary gift that we have, which allows us to kind of escape self-destruction, is the ability to describe and think about alternative futures. How do we, both on the hope side and the fear side, come together to create the same sorts of narratives? Or do you think we're being fed those already? Do you think certain agendas about the future are being fed down to us in a way to keep a population very subdued about the potential crisis that may or may not be on the horizon?
I certainly think there's some of that. I don't think we know how much, but there are certain narratives that serve certain constituencies. There is the unfortunate fact in some ways that we are so well taken care of in the first world with respect to basic needs that the things that should trigger us to worry, just we're not getting those signals. And so this really does come down to a black swan problem where the thing comes out of nowhere, and by the time it does, there's nothing to do about it. So we have to anticipate that and take it seriously. But I also think we are strangely being robbed of some of our best tools for navigating difficult subjects. So I think this is less true on this side of the pond, but in the US, comedy has become almost impossible, right? And this is, the comics themselves tell us that they don't go to colleges anymore. It's not worth it. And people are constantly, policing them morally on Twitter and elsewhere. And the problem is that comedy is maybe the key mechanism whereby we play with concepts that are uncomfortable at the edge of consciousness. And so our comics are very important. And to the extent that our comics are either sidelined or have been co-opted into some game where they're looking for applause rather than laughs, we can't discover that actually we all do know that something is a bit wrong, and we disagree a little bit over what exactly it is, but that it's something we have to confront. So anyway, I would say we need to give our comics leeway if we're to navigate this, and we're doing exactly the opposite.
You don't think humor evolved for that particular purpose, though, do you?
Oh, I kind of do. Yeah. Humor is clearly about discovering things on the fringe of consciousness, and the things on the fringe can be of many different types. So it's not necessarily for existential threats, but it certainly is for things that are hard to navigate just by, analysis. So
it's great to have conversations like this, but from an everyday level, how do we walk that tightrope between just survival and thrival? So as you're walking down the street worrying about paying your tax bill, you are less concerned about the long-term survival of the human species. It's not really a thing, unless you are deeply, deeply traumatized, it's not really a thing that you think about every single waking second, and nor should it be. Do you think it's going to catch us by surprise? Do you think we need to have a retraining of how we think about futures?
Well, I rather suspect that this is quite an individual puzzle, that how you grapple with the magnitude of the questions that we face is very personal. And so, I know how I do it, and I know how the people I know well do it, and I know how I navigated it in a classroom with students, and I know how Heather, my wife, who also taught at Evergreen, navigated it with students. And so those are all versions of this, but it may be that there are other mechanisms that work better for other people. And really the point is you need to know that you're looking for some way of simultaneously not letting your life in the present go to hell as you're trying to grapple with these big existential questions. And that at the end of the day, you need to be okay with it. If it's going to depress you to the point that you can't get out of bed, then that's obviously not viable. So you have to find a mechanism. Mine involves what I call the cosmic joke, which can be told, I'm sure, an infinite number of ways. But when you realize what we are, and how preposterous it is that, given what we are evolutionarily, that we're even here having a conversation about this question, it's pretty funny, right? The idea that, the ooze is now beginning to worry about making the world a place that can't support us. So for me, it involves humor. For others, it may involve grief. And, if I'm perfectly honest with you, maybe I went through some of that too, just recognizing that there's a way in which I still think the problem can be solved, or I wouldn't be talking about it, but I do think there's a fair chance we won't. And somehow, I have to be okay with the fact that it's worth taking a shot, but that at some level, if it doesn't get solved, I don't want to have to confront myself and say, did you not do enough? Were there other things you could have said, other people you could have talked to? I don't want to have that conversation. But if I feel like I've done my best to lay out the puzzle so other people can see it, we took a shot, and it'll either work or it won't work. But it has to be okay to have taken your best shot and then seen what happens.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the potential bedtime stories about the future that were being sold to help us sleep at night? And those are the growth stories. There's a belief that, look, if we can't grow anymore on this planet, that the one way we're going to go is to the stars, and that's being sold quite heavily on West Coast areas of your country in the US. And also Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is being sold as an infinite growth potential. AI is the idea of an infinite growth of a workforce. Do you believe that these are agenda-led narratives, or do you think they could actually be the thing that allows us to have another boom?
Did you say gender-led?
Agenda.
Got it. All right. Sorry, I may
you have
very
selective for good reasons.
American hearing.
For good reasons.
Yeah.
All right.
They are. Let's put it this way.
Right.
Agenda-led.
Elon Musk and his buddies.
Yeah. I don't know. I tend to think that they are more the result of very particular echo chambers than they are designed to placate. So, I particularly find the one about us going to Mars a bit shocking, because as much as I think it's tantalizing that human beings would get to Mars, I also know it's no place to live. Even if you could make it technically habitable.
But that's the promise of the geographical frontier as opposed to the transfer frontier, which is much more terrifying.
Yes, although you have to think about whether the particular piece of geography is a desirable one. Mars, I think, would be cool for 2-3 days, and then there's nothing to see, right? Even all the rocks are the same color. So my feeling, and on the flip side, it is always, until the moment that the Earth is no longer habitable, it is always going to be easier to fix this planet than it is to make that one function. So I see zero hope, for Mars as a sort of, escape continent for the Earth.
All right, but back to technological frontier, the argument is if we work out how to terraform Mars, we'll work out how to fix this planet in the process. So let's continue that narrative for that reason.
Good. Well, in 400 years, we can have that conversation again. But for the moment, let's talk about the issue. You mentioned Bitcoin, you mentioned AI. And I think we have, again, we're talking about symptoms of an unnamed problem. So in this case, we've got a bunch of technologies. I think many of them do have great promise, but the context that they're being generated is one in which we have this mind-numbing economic paradigm, one that actually is in love with this insane model of growth. And it really is insane. So the example I like to use to point this out is, let's say that one of us invents a refrigerator, and it would last 10 times as long as your current refrigerator, and in every other way be your current refrigerator's equal. That's economically bad, right? Because it's going to result in fewer refrigerators being sold, so it's going to result in a depression in growth. Surely our economic system should view that new refrigerator as a win, but it views it as a loss because our model views economic health as the shift of useful kinds of energy into useless heat and the transition of useless raw materials into unrecoverable trash, right? That's what economic health is to us. We have to get over that, right? We have to rethink the whole thing. And if we rethought the economic model And then we took some of these technologies seriously, AI, Bitcoin, all the rest. It is possible, fusion really ought to be on that list. It is quite possible that we could harness these things and we could make quite a good, stable, safe, fair planet. If we pursue all of these technologies a la carte and we leave the economic model off the table, then each of these things are going to get subsumed into this very broken style of thinking that we've gotten used to. And I'm afraid even fusion, which might be the one technology, the silver bullet technology that'd be capable of fixing the planet, I don't want to say in one fell swoop, but a trajectory from the discovery of viable fusion could lead us to a functional world. But if we actually allow fusion to come to maturity under our current models, I don't think that's what would happen at all. I think we would end up basically increasing the power of a dangerous political mode, and it would be a disaster.
But then the issue of relying on those sorts of systems and those sorts of economic models is currently they're very short term. I think with the exception of what Jeff Bezos has promised with regards to playing with the future or playing in the future to allow his stock price to be at a loss in the present, he's one of the very few who's managed to kind of engineer that model for himself, but it's not really the most efficient way to build futures. And I know you've argued that truly efficient markets need to get rid of what Google was talking about, which was the don't be evil paradox, and take a brand new approach to risk, which is let's throw the baby out with the bathwater and really drive this thing to the extremity to just see what happens. Do you think that's also a potential?
I think it's a much bigger conversation, but what you pointed to in the beginning of your question is that there is a trade-off between how effectively you play in the short term and how you play in the long term, which is in fact why fusion energy has remained outside of reach to this point, is that it has not paid anybody yet to invest in it in the way we would have to invest in it to get there, because you wouldn't necessarily live to see the monetary rewards that would come from it. So anyway, that would be a great place for some governance apparatus to have stepped in. Maybe the economic system has finally delivered us the technology that will do it. There are hints that might be on the horizon. But in some sense, if you don't want people playing their narrow self-interest against our collective long-term well-being, then you have to make sure that it doesn't pay to do so. And if you want us to invest in solutions for multi-generation problems, then you have to correct for the fact that short-term will always win out in a perfectly free market. Short-term will always win out against very long-term, because very long-term is basically a dry spell that you have to endure. So anybody who's playing for profits in the very short term drives you extinct before your long-term wisdom shows itself to be accurate. If you want us to behave differently, you have to be willing to structure the incentives so that they reward the kind of behavior that you want to see, which I know lots of people will hear as a very frightening idea. But I think it can be done actually relatively humanely and with a light hand, so we don't end up over meddling and doing what the left frequently does, which is fail to appreciate the downsides of solution making. So anyway, I would love to see us engage that question at a society-wide level and do so